Hello everyone, Panzer J back with a new video. This is my first new video in a while. And this is Historical Board Gaming's Global War 1939. Now the board is set up for turn one. So all the countries have their units on the board. As you can see, Europe is quite packed with units, especially the black here is Germany. They're just like on top of each other. There's so many different units in the German territories. But that's going to thin out here pretty quick because, as you know, Germany goes first, and they have the second impulse on turn one, so they're going to be doing a whole bunch of attacks. Turn one itself usually takes, once you go through each of the countries, the complete turn one, probably upwards of 2 hours or so, even with experienced players, just because Germany alone has so many moves to make, so many different attacks and whatnot. And if we scan over a little bit into the Pacific, everything's set up for the initial turn one here. So we've got the National Chinese here, green, and the Communist Chinese, the purple. We got the Far East Command, yellow down here. The Far East Command is more like a tan. These yellow pieces here represent the Axis, pro-Axis miners, or the leaning Axis powers. We've got the orange here is the Dutch, but again, the orange is going to represent the pro-Allied and the Allied-leaning countries. We got Anzac down here in gray. Japan here is kind of like the burnt or the darker orange, and then the red units here are the veteran Japanese troops, the fighters and the infantry. And then the U.S. over here is olive drab, green. Up top, scanning back up here into Russia. Russia is brown. Going back over into Europe and Africa, we've got the British are a kind of a darker tan with the yellow chips there. The Italians are brown on brown. Now these light blue are the French Foreign Legion, obviously for France. The regular French units are in the dark blue. Germany is in black. Again, these yellow units here are going to be the pro-Axis countries. The orange, Yugoslavia and Greece down here, Poland up here, pro-Allied. The white pieces, which we've got here in Spain, up in Switzerland, up in Norway and Sweden, those are strict neutrals. And then panning back over here, Canada, we have in the British darker tan, and then again the U.S. here in the olive drab green. Down into South America, we got some pro-Axis and Allied countries. So everything's pretty color coordinated. I kind of have a little bit of thing about that. I like having the chips go with the color of the pieces for each country. Each chip represents just a single unit, so obviously you can have some pretty big stacks, especially as you get later in the game. You know, you got 10, 15, 20 infantry. The stack's going to be, 14, 19 with a guy on top. So it makes it for, kind of gets the territories maybe a little bit more congested, but again, I just think it looks cool having everything color coordinated like that. And in this game, Canada is merging with the UK, so you have that option is to play Canada separate. But in the games that we play, Canada is always part of the UK, their economy and their units and whatnot. So this is the initial setup. Now this game is going to be solo gameplay. don't have anybody coming over to play it, so we're going to do a little bit of a solo game. Keep things nice and fair and balanced. See how things turn out. Hopefully, when the weather turns maybe a little bit worse, get the Incredible Falcon Agent 367 back over here and we can start playing some games again. We haven't played since the spring. But for now, everything's set up. Global War 39 from some solo play. So I'm going to do a video at the end of each turn and then go ahead and post one long video of that together at the end. So we'll see you back at the end of turn 1. Good luck to everybody. Okay, folks, let's take a look at how things stand at the end of turn 1 in this solo game of Global War 39. So overall, I think turn 1 was very productive for the Axis, as it usually is. They start out much stronger militarily than the Allies do. Not to mention that several allies like the Russians and the United States aren't actually in the conflict at this point. So it's the beginning of the game is very much dictated by the Axis, and that has played itself out so far here in turn 1. Let's take a look at Germany first. They do go first in the game, and on turn 1 they did have the 2 impulses, and they took advantage of that. So as you can see here in Europe, a lot of German roundels on the board here. A lot of swastikas flying throughout Europe. They've taken over. Every country is either aligned with them or been conquered in Europe itself. So they came into France. They took Reims on the first impulse fairly easily and then came into Paris, and Paris fell even easier than that. The Germans had some good rolls there. They still have a stack of about a half a dozen tanks, a few mechs, and a couple of men in Paris. Poland as well went into West Poland on the first impulse, and then Warsaw on the second impulse. And they have a few tanks, a few mechs, and a couple artillery still in Warsaw. They activated Romania and Hungary on impulse 1, Bulgaria on impulse 2, as well as Finland on impulse 2. This transport over here brought a man up from Stettin and activated Finland. As far as over here by Norway, they took Narvik on the first impulse and came up to Oslo, took Oslo on the first impulse and then came up to Narvik. Denmark fell, so did Holland. And then a couple of gambles by Germany. I don't always see this being the case. Sometimes I see Yugoslavia and Greece being left for Italy, or possibly the German player doesn't feel like he is strong enough to take those. But went ahead and rolled the dice, and both Yugoslavia and Greece fell. As you can see, there's not much left, a single man in Yugoslavia and a mech in Greece. And the Germans did lose several fighters in those two battles combined. I think 3 fighters total. At that point, they had to start choosing the air units as casualties so that they had a ground unit available to still capture the territory. So what had happened is Germany kind of positioned themselves after the first impulse so that on the second impulse they could go into both Greece and Yugoslavia. They had a stack of, I believe, about 4 or 5 men in Austria as kind of like the cannon fodder, along with some planes. And Yugoslavia fell, and then Greece was was even closer. The Germans could only maneuver 2 mechs down to even reach Greece on turn 1. So it was 2 mechs and a handful of planes, I think a bomber, a couple of tactical bombers, and a few fighters. And the Greeks didn't roll so well. or they could have possibly forced the Germans to take all the planes as casualties if they still wanted to have a ground unit left to actually take Greece. But the Germans nonetheless lost one of the mechs and I believe 2 fighters. So it was semi-costly, but the Germans were able to secure all of southeastern Europe there. And more importantly, they prevented the British from being able to come over on their turn and activate Greece or Yugoslavia themselves now that Germany has possession of them. And if you remember from the opening setup, Yugoslavia just has a single destroyer, but the Greeks have, I believe, a destroyer, maybe a sub, and a couple of coastal battleships, maybe. So a decent naval presence. So if the British are able to get over there on turn 1, because Germany doesn't conquer those 2 countries, then they can add not only obviously the income and the ground units. And again, the ground units aren't insignificant either. Yugoslavia has like 5 infantry, a couple artillery, and a fighter, and Greece has maybe 3 infantry and an artillery, something along those lines. But anyways, it's not insignificant, the forces the British will add to their side. So definitely Germany wanted to come in and take both of those countries, and it was a close run thing, but they did take both of them. As far as naval combat goes, Germany came over and took out this fleet up here north of Scotland. They also came over and took out the 2 transports and the destroyer down here. So this fleet that was sitting here by London, south of Ireland here, that fleet Germany didn't even attempt to take. The kind of resources were getting spread a little thin, so Germany didn't even try with that battle. But most of the naval combat went Germany's way as well. As you can see up here, Germany still has a coastal battleship, a cruiser, and 5 subs. They are convoying this box here, taking $3 away from Canada, which Canada and the UK are combined in this game. So it's, in essence, UK money they're taken away from. The only naval combat that didn't really go Germany's way was they had positioned a couple of subs down here, and then the 1 German cruiser from by South America came up, and they went into this sea zone here, 35, to take on 2 British destroyers and a British sub, and the Germans got completely wiped out. They lost 3 subs and their cruiser, and there was still a British destroyer left, so that definitely didn't go Germany's way there. Other than that, they had also, at the end of their turn, were convoying both of these boxes here. So they were convoying $9 off of the British at the end of Germany's turn there. So overall, Germany accomplished quite a bit on turn 1. They're sitting at $63 in income plus. And then on top of that, whatever bonuses they get, which at this point they're getting $10 worth of bonuses, so quite a bit of income. And they also got the $10 off of the French for taking Paris. Then as far as some of the roles for the Germans did set up the Vichy government, so had a role for all the remaining French territories and ships to see if they would go Germany, Vichy, Free French, or in the case of the ships, get scuttled. Also, the roles for some of the naval units from the strict neutral countries that Germans invaded and captured their capitals, such as Denmark and Norway. So the roles actually, again, as far as the ships go, went Germany's way. The British really didn't gain much of anything. Honestly, most of the ships were sunk across the board. Up here, between Denmark and Norway, the Germans got a coastal battleship and a coastal sub. And I don't think the British got anything. And everything else was scuttled. As far as French units, the French ships go, the British did get a sub and a destroyer out of the Mediterranean French naval units. And then these 2 destroyers up here, the light blue ones, are representing the Vichy, and then the Germans did get a destroyer as well. So in the Med, it was about even. Up in the Atlantic there, the Northern Atlantic, it was more weighted towards Germany. As far as the territories go, again, Germans got really lucky with some of the rolls. The British did get Syria and gained that. They also got Rio de Oro over here. So that got them a couple of bucks. The territories here in Central Africa that aren't worth anything went kind of split down the middle. The British did get Madagascar over here. But up here is where Germany really got some good rolls up here in Northern Africa. All three of these Northern African territories that are worth anything, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, all three of those went Germany. So that was worth $3. But even more importantly than the $3, the French Foreign Legion that's based up here, I started off with Morocco, so then they moved to Algeria since that went German. They then have to vacate to a adjacent friendly territory. So they went to Northern Algeria, then rolled for Northern Algeria. That went German. So then they moved over here to Tunisia. So in Tunisia, you had all, I believe it's 7 of the French Foreign Legion units. And then Tunisia went German as well. So then there was no adjacent friendly territory for them to move to. So they just get wiped off the board. So that was 7 units for the Allies completely taken off the board, which was huge. Just the 7 units in and of itself, but specifically now the Italians didn't have anything to worry about on this side of their African territories, and that's huge because usually the French Foreign Legion are quite a bit of a thorn in the Italian side. They can usually come right into Tripoli right on the turn that the British are at war with Italy. So that was huge for the Axis. And then up in France, the 3 remaining French territories were all rolled for. And again, all 3 went for Germany. So that was a total of $5. And again, these light blue pieces here represent the Vichy French. Now they can't move and attack or attack. They only can defend. So in a sense, they're kind of useless, but at least from Germany's perspective, they didn't go British. And then I do have Vichy markers, but since all these territories are in essence German, they collect the money from them and whatnot, just to make things easier, less complicated. I just put down German markers for the territories that are actually Vichy. Over in the Pacific, as far as the territories go, the Japanese got a couple of territories. So when you roll for the Vichy's, whether it's going to be Free French or Vichy, the territories, the ones in the Pacific go Japanese. So those 2 went for the Axis. Over here, one went, Saigon here went for the Allies, so that's the Far East Command. And then French Indochina went Japanese. So the Japanese picked up $1 there, so that wasn't too bad for them. As far as the ships go, again, since Germany took Holland, the capital, we had a roll for the ships down here, and these went more for the Allies. The Allies got some good rolls here. The Japanese didn't get any of the ships that were down here. I think 2 or 3 of them were scuttled, but then Anzac, the Australians here, got a destroyer and a coastal battleship, I believe. So that went the Allies' way. So in the rest of Europe, the British responded, not doing a whole heck of a lot. The fleet that was up here, as the British player can see, really didn't have much of a chance of survivability with this big German fleet still up here. Plus the Germans had positioned all of their remaining aircraft here in Western Germany. You got a couple of bombers, 5 tacticals, and 2 fighters. So the Germans, if the British would have sat here with that fleet, would have been able to use this fleet up here along with a big-time air force to come in and bomb that. So the British kind of took off, and they're now positioned down here, down by Gibraltar, what was left of the British home fleet. They also came over and were able to take out the sub that was one sub each that was convoying these two boxes. So they got that $6 back. And then they also came over from South Africa, landed over here. Liberia activated that for the British, so got that guy and that buck. And now they're positioned right next door to come over to South America on the next turn, possibly, and start activating these countries, that income, and those units. So that wasn't too bad for the British. In Africa, they built a couple of tanks down in South Africa. They put a miner factory down in Cairo and beefed up those defenses a little bit. Then the British fleet that was in the Med, again, the British go before the Italians in turn order. And on turn one, they're not at war. So the British are not able to use this fleet to attack the Italians like they can in Axis and Allies 1940. So you want to pull the British out of there. No sense in keeping the British there. And then so that on the Italians' turn, they are then able to attack the British. So, and that would have been an overwhelming number of Italian naval units there in the Med that could have attacked. So the British went ahead and pulled that back. They pulled back a few sea zones, and now they're combined with the Far East Command fleet that's off of India here. And so a pretty sizable fleet the British Far East Command got going on over by India. Other than that, the British didn't do a whole heck of a lot. They built up a few fighters in England, and they're sitting at $39, so not too bad. But then the turn got worse for the British after that. As far as the Russians, they're making a play for Finland. So this was something that I employed quite effectively in the last game with Agent 367 and the Incredible Falk. So what the Russian strategy is here in Europe, they did not go into the Baltic states or East Poland. They've left them for the Germans. So, and the Russian thinking on that is that now, not only is that a buffer they now have between themselves and Germany before the Germans can actually get to Russian territory and units, but now they don't have to expend those units to take those territories, and they're not worth a whole heck of a lot, $3 total. So the Russians went ahead and left those for the Germans. They also went ahead and pulled all the units back from their border, left just a single infantry in each territory, and kind of building up in some of the more interior territories to maybe counterattack the Germans. But the big thing they did is up here in the north, they bought 5 infantry, spent all $15 they had, put them in Karelia. They went into Finland, took the first Finnish territory, and then moved a bunch of other stuff. Their entire air force is up here in Karelia, and some of the mobile units that they're able to reach came up north and into Leningrad as well. So now they are well positioned to move further into Finland with the goal of hopefully taking all of Finland, and then once war has started, moving into maybe Norway and disrupting at least the northern prong of the inevitable German offensive. The Russian fleet came out from over here and just moved a few sea zones over to here just to position themselves to, once they are at war, to maybe make some noise in the Atlantic. Over here on the Pacific side of the map, the Russians took all their units they have in Novosibirsk and are making their way towards the Pacific coast here. So the thinking with that is, again, in the last game that we had, Japan and Russia actually ended up in conflict. So the Russians want to get some units over there to possibly go into these Japanese territories and start taking some of this income away from the Japanese. So everything has been moved over. The tanks moved a couple of spaces. The infantry and artillery here moved one. And then they do have a single tank that broke off heading down here into southern Russia to get into these pro-Allied countries and get the income from that. So that was pretty much it for the Russians on turn one. Then Italy really had a good turn as well. They kind of followed up with what Germany did, and they're already putting a lot of pressure on the British. So they declared war on the British. They came over and took these couple of adjacent British North African territories, Alexandria and Lower Egypt. They took both of those. Again, they have nothing to worry about from their back door, so to speak, because the French Foreign Legion were completely wiped out. Now, there was some thought of possibly coming over, landing in Syria, but instead what they did was they took their 2 transports and pretty much their entire navy, minus these 3 subs and this destroyer they're sitting over here by Cairo, and they actually came over and took Gibraltar. So the British had, you start out with a guy and there's a fortress there, and the British actually had landed both of their bombers that had participated in taking out these couple of German subs that were convoying, and they landed there. So the Italians came over with 2 transports, 4 guys. They took some planes, and they had the shore bombardment from a battleship and a couple of cruisers, and were able to take Gibraltar. And that did a few things. First of all, obviously it took out both of those British bombers, so that was huge. But now, with taking Gibraltar, you cannot get into the Mediterranean as a surface ship unless you control Gibraltar. So, for instance, the Axis, if this was still British controlled, wouldn't be able to come out of the Med with anything but subs, and vice versa. Now that this is under Italian control, the Allies, whether it's the British or the United States, once they're in the conflict, cannot come into the Mediterranean until they retake Gibraltar. So now this end of the Mediterranean is completely cut off. And the Italians now, with this huge navy they've got sitting there, they've got a couple of subs, 4 destroyers, a couple of cruisers, a couple of transports, and a battleship. Now they can, on the next Italian turn, here on turn 2, they can actually come out here and start making some noise in the Atlantic. So that was huge for the Italians to take Gibraltar. And then the planes that they used in the different combats, a couple landed over here. The rest landed in Tobruk. As far as purchases, the Italians went ahead and just purchased a minor factory that they placed in Tobruk. And then as far as income, they're sitting at $30. So not too bad for the Italians. Over in the Pacific, starting with the Japanese, they go second in turn order. The Japanese didn't do a J1 attack. So at the beginning of the game, they're just in conflict with national and communist Chinese forces. So the Japanese didn't go ahead and attack the Western Allies yet. So in China, they went ahead and took a couple of Chinese territories. They didn't go too crazy. As you can see, the communist Chinese kind of came back and went into a couple of vacant Japanese territories. And then the national Chinese got, especially right here, a fairly large stack of infantry. The Japanese don't have a whole lot of ground units in China right now. They did purchase a minor factory they put down here in Shanghai, and they also bought a couple of more transports. But they kind of went light into China, and the reason why, as you can see down here, there is a whole lot of stuff coming for Calcutta. So again, this was something that was done in the last game I played and was extremely effective for the Japanese. So their priority number 1 is the Far East Command. They want to take the Far East Command out. Other than the United States, the Far East Command is the strongest power the Japanese will face in the Pacific in terms of economically and militarily. So they're going hard for Calcutta. So as you can see, they positioned a lot of stuff down here in the South Pacific. We've got a couple of transports with 3 veteran infantry and a naval landing unit. You've got like 4 cruisers down here, 4 destroyers, like 4 subs. Over here, you got a couple of more cruisers and destroyers, a couple battleships coming. They went ahead and activated Siam on this first turn. So now they've got those units available. And then their entire Air Force, or at least a large part of it, landed down here in Hainan, this island down here. So what they're positioning themselves for is possibly right on turn 2, they're going to come over and try to take Calcutta right away, turn 2. So Japan is well positioned now. The Far East Command did respond. The British were able to put 2 units in Calcutta, so they went ahead and used part of their income to put 2 infantry there. And then the Far East Command, even though it's only a minor factory, they're able to put 3 units above and beyond the 3 that the minor factory could produce. So they went ahead and used all the money they had and put 5 more infantry. So altogether, 7 infantry were added. So if Japan, as far as what the chances are on turn 2, I mean, the Japanese are only going to have 4 ground units that can actually reach at this point. I mean, they are going to have the shore bombardment, so that's 4 cruisers worth of shore bombards, and they do have a couple of planes, but I don't think these veteran fighters can actually reach. I mean, you're 1, 2, 3. I mean, I'm going to have to look exactly to see. I mean, depends on if you're going to count this sea zone. If you count that sea zone as another move before you can reach India, that's 4 right there. Those veteran fighters aren't going to be able to reach. So the Japanese might have to hold off 1 more turn. And if that's the case, it's probably about another 5, 7 guys that are going to be put down in India. So it's going to be close. But on the 3rd turn, Japan would be able to come back with all of these planes, the shore bombardments from a couple of battleships, as well as another transport with a couple more guys. So I think at that point, Japan would have enough to take Calcutta, but we'll see. So that's the Japanese plan here on turn 1. They poured everything down here on south, making a heavy run towards Calcutta. The transports they bought, they want to start moving this big stack of guys here in Tokyo off of the home island into possibly the fight here against the Chinese, or maybe even down here in the South Pacific, maybe start getting some of these money islands. They positioned these 2 loaded carriers are making their way down. They want to come down to the Caroline Islands, take advantage of that naval base with the extra movement that it provides, and do some damage maybe down here in the South Pacific. The Japanese finished with $46, I believe, on their turn. So not too bad for Japan. The Far East Command responded again by just dumping everything they had worth of infantry in Calcutta. They came down, landed here in Borneo, and got that $4. So that was good. And then they do have a decent-sized fleet over here, combined with what the British brought over, although it's really not going to be enough to stand up against what Japan's bringing down here. So we'll have to see how that plays itself out. The Australians combined the couple of naval units that they got from the dice rolls with Holland's, with the Dutch Navy, and they brought all that down here by Sydney. They did come over here and take a couple of the, took this Money Island down here, as well as Dutch New Guinea up here, so they got a couple extra dollars. The Far East Command is sitting at $30, though, because they didn't lose any territories the Japanese didn't attack, and they gained Borneo. So $30 for the Far East Command and $13 for Australia, so not too bad. The Chinese, again, the Communist Chinese came into a couple of vacant Japanese territories. The Chinese did try to come back into here, and they got wiped out. It was 3 guys against 1, and they lost all 3 without getting a hit on that lone Japanese infantry. And then they just stacked up most of their guys in this one territory here, kind of like a dam, I guess, against the Japanese flood, trying to build up enough of a force where they can kind of counterattack. As far as the U.S. goes, not a lot that they can do on turn one. They're obviously not at war. So this big U.S. fleet that's over here by Hawaii peeled off. They'll want to leave them there as kind of sitting ducks for the Japanese when the Japanese might decide to attack. So they went ahead and came off this side in the Pacific, and they made their way all the way over here. So they're down here by Panama. So a pretty good U.S. fleet there. A battleship, a couple destroyers, a loaded carrier, a cruiser, and a transport. And the thinking behind that is they want to come up on the next turn and be off of the coast of the United States here, so that when the U.S. is in the war, they've already got a pretty good fleet ready to intervene in the Atlantic, going up against the Germans and now possibly the Italians as well. Other than that, the U.S. didn't really do a whole heck of a lot. They peeled this destroyer off from the Philippines down here. They saved all their money. So not a whole heck of a lot for the U.S. to do. As far as the rolls, the Russian roll didn't go that great for their income. They rolled a 9. So they've got to be at 48 before they can declare war themselves, unless obviously they were attacked beforehand. The U.S. rolls a little bit better. They got 11, but they did also get the $5 or the 5 bonus because the Germans attacked France. So at the end of turn one, the Russians at 9, the U.S. at 16, in terms of where they are got to be to declare war themselves. So that's the end of turn one. We'll be back when we've completed turn two. Okay, let's take a look at how things stand at the end of turn two. So the Axis continue the onslaught. Honestly, the way things are going, we're only 2 turns in, so still probably have quite a bit of time left. But the Axis are really putting a hurting on the Allies at this point. Now, the action slowed down quite a bit, especially on the European side, after the first turn and the frenzy of all the German moves that they always do on turn one. A lot of this turn was just maneuvering pieces around and very, very little combat, at least on the European side of the board. So let's take a look and see how things kind of look for the Germans and the Italian, the Axis powers here in Europe. So Germany spread out some subs throughout the Atlantic. So you still got 1 convoy box up here, this Canadian box being convoyed. And then a handful of subs are starting to make their way down into the middle Atlantic there. As you can see, there's no British ships at all in the Atlantic. These right here are Russian. The Russians continue to move this little navy into position around England itself. And the Germans still have a coastal battleship, a regular battleship, and a cruiser over here. The battle up here heating up a little bit in Finland, though. It went back and forth. The Germans and their Finnish allies went ahead and took this territory back, and then the Russians then went ahead and took it right back on their turn. But the Germans did beef up a lot of defenses up here. They brought their entire air force up here into Helsinki. So that's a couple of bombers, 3 fighters, and 5 tactical bombers. So it's definitely not going to be a cakewalk for Russia. And as a matter of fact, with all those planes, the Germans have quite a bit of an offensive punch to push back on the Russians. So now I'm starting to think maybe Finland isn't going to follow the Russians like it looked after turn one. The Germans also went ahead and upgraded this minor factory in Stettin to a major, and then purchased a major factory they put down in Romania. So now they have 4 major factories on the board. And this major factory in Stettin, they also put a couple of newly purchased men down there. So what the German plan is using this transport up here outside of Helsinki to come down, pick up these 2 guys and bring them back, drop them off into Helsinki to continue to beef up the defenses there. They definitely do not want Finland to fall, because as you can see, there's nothing preventing the Russians at that point, once they are at war, to just come right through Norway. And not only do you lose the income, the territory income, but that's also part of a $5 German bonus. So Germans are doing everything they can to hold on to Finland, and that's why their entire air force is up there, as well as they're going to start ferrying troops over. They also went ahead and put 3 newly purchased men in Paris. They kept the stack of tanks there, even though the Allies are nowhere near being able to land back in France. Germany figures to just continue to build up as much as they can so that when the inevitable invasion does come, they've got quite a bit of a strong force. They didn't really want to wait a few turns to start putting stuff in there. They want to put stuff in there pretty much every turn if they can. Besides that, they just maneuvered stuff around. Some units, some mechs and men left Western Europe and made their way to Western Germany. And then all of the Axis minor powers in Hungary and Bulgaria, everything moved up here into Romania. So as you can see, right on the border with the Soviet Union, there's tons of German units, German minor powers units, big stack of men, some artillery and whatnot. So the Germans definitely starting to position themselves for Operation Barbarossa. Also in Warsaw, they got 3 or 4 mechs, 3 or 4 tanks, and 3 artillery. So definitely starting to, like I said, build for the invasion of Russia. Not sure it'll come on turn 3, I would assume. If not, then definitely turn 4, but we'll see how that plays itself out. As far as Italy goes, again, they kind of slowed down, didn't really... They had a couple of transports over here by Gibraltar, but really they were out of position to like move any more troops around. So the Italians didn't launch any attacks. They pulled their entire air force up here into Tobruk. They bought 2 tanks and a mech, which they placed in the minor here in Tobruk, and then also bought 2 transports, which they put down outside of Rome. And the 2 transports that were over by Gibraltar came back. So now on the next turn here, turn 3, the Italians have 4 transports, and they do have a handful of men, an artillery piece, and a tank in Italy itself. So they're going to be able to maneuver around, maybe start taking up some of these empty territories like Corinth, Crete, maybe even come over here, land in Syria. So the Italians have a few options with those transports. The rest of the Navy that was outside of Gibraltar, since the Italians now control Gibraltar, they're able to come out into the Atlantic. And as you can see, the Italian Navy definitely making their presence felt. We got 4 destroyers, a battleship, 2 cruisers, and 2 subs just outside of Gibraltar there in the Atlantic. So the Italians ready to make some moves there. Also, the 1 German destroyer that was outside of southern France came out into the Atlantic as well. So that's pretty much it for the Axis. For the Allies on the European side, the British had a few good things happen. They came over from Liberia, landed in Brazil, and activated all 4 of those territories. That was worth $4, plus they got, I think, like 4 guys. This coastal battleship, as well as a transport. Besides that, the British Navy that was up here came down, and they combined with the new units they just picked up. So they've got a coastal battleship, a cruiser, 3 destroyers, a sub, and 2 transports. So not a great Navy, but it's all the British really have left in the Atlantic besides this 1 lone destroyer. In Africa, the British went ahead and bought 3 tanks, which they placed in South Africa. And the tanks and men they already had there starting to make their way up into Central Africa. And they also bought 3 fighters, which they placed in Alexandria. So, in Cairo. They placed their 3 fighters down there in that minor complex. So starting to beef up the defenses in Cairo as well as giving them a little bit of an offensive punch. Besides that, they didn't do a whole lot in England. Kind of just stayed put. Thought about using these 6 fighters to attack the German ships right there. That's a battleship, a coastal battleship, and a cruiser, because the Germans had pulled all their air cover up to Helsinki, so there was no German fighters available to defend. But that's really all England has left in England itself, is these 6 fighters. I mean, they got a couple of men, but not much else. So I didn't really want to waste the 6 fighters, and it was probably pretty much an even battle anyways. Each of those battleships take 2 hits. and the cruiser takes 1. So that's basically, in essence, 5 German hits against just the 6 hits for the fighters. So it was about even, and the battleships also hit on a higher die roll as well. So it was probably about 50-50, so didn't really see much to be gained from the British point of view. Even if they would have taken out all 3 of those ships, they would have probably lost pretty much all the fighters. So they held off on that. One thing the British did do that bled over into the Pacific was, if you remember on turn 1, they had pulled their entire navy that was outside of Cairo down here and combined with the Far East Command fleet that was outside of Bombay here. And that combined fleet went ahead and took on a Japanese fleet, which we'll talk about in a minute, and had some success there. That was pretty much it for the British. As far as the Russians go, again, they came back and took the territory that had switched hands. But other than that, they're, again, spreading their units out, 1 guy per territory, so there's not really much for the Germans to attack on their opening turn. So if you remember correctly, on the German initial invasion of Russia, they get to pick 1 territory, kind of like the Japanese sneak attack. So it really puts the Russians at a disadvantage. So they don't want to stack up a bunch of stuff on the border in 1 territory and give the Germans, kind of the ability to just wipe out that big stack of stuff. So they just got 1 guy in each territory. Other than that, they only had $10 to spend. They saved that. And like I said, it's looking like a seesaw battle up north. I'm not sure the Russians are going to continue to push through here because of all that German aircraft. As far as income goes, Russia rolled 13, so they're up to $22. Germany is collecting 63 plus bonuses. Italy, 30 plus bonuses, and UK 43 plus bonuses. The Russians were also able to bring this lone tank down and take Iran, activate all 3 of those territories, which are worth $3 to Russia, as well as they got a couple of free men. So that was good for Russia. In the Pacific, as far as the Russians go, they continue to maneuver things around up here. These men and these artillery moved to space. The tanks moved up a couple of spaces, and they moved a couple more guys into the Vladivostok territory with that fortress. So just kind of gearing up for a possible clash with the Japanese. So that was pretty much it for the European powers. As far as the Pacific goes, starting with Japan, they're up to $55 plus bonuses, and they actually have a couple of bonuses going on. They had a good turn in some ways. They went ahead and they did go ahead and roll the dice and attacked Calcutta. They were able to bring over 4 ground units, 3 veteran infantry, and 1 naval landing unit, along with 4 cruisers for shore bombardment, a bomber, and 1 fighter. And as you can see, 1 veteran infantry lived, but so did the bomber and the fighter, which flew back to Siam on non-combat. But it was pretty close. The Japanese went ahead and used that as one of their sneak attacks. So the first round they were able to fire without Far East Command hitting back, and that took, I think, like 3 of the 9 infantry off. And then, like I said, it was just pretty close all the way down. But Japan did end up taking Calcutta, so the Far East Command is in essence is now wiped out as far as the ability to produce new units. So that was a huge gain for Japan. Plus, part of their bonuses is $5 for Calcutta. So that really helped out Japan. They used a second sneak attack down here in Singapore. And again, they took that. So that's worth another $5 bonus for Singapore itself. And then their third sneak attack that they used, now their sneak attacks are all used up, was they came down here to take on this Australian Navy. All they brought down was 3 subs and a destroyer. So the odds were definitely against Japan. But with the sneak attack, the free round of attacks, they figured, well, maybe. But the rolls didn't go so good, and I think Japan ended up taking out like 1 sub at the loss of 3 subs and a destroyer. So that sneak attack definitely didn't go well. But the rest of it, especially in Southeast Asia here with Singapore falling, and they took Calcutta, took the Far East Command out, that was huge. In China, again, things went their way. They came back up here and took out the 2 communist Chinese infantry that had taken Japanese territories up here. They also They kind of just stayed put in China itself. And then the Communist Chinese tried to push back with a group of infantry and got totally wiped out. So Communist Chinese is just down to an infantry and an artillery. For purchases for Japan, they went ahead and purchased 2 minor industrial complexes and a couple of transports. So, or not transports, they bought 3 tanks and 2 minor complexes. So one of the minor complexes they put up here, just outside of Shantung, and then the other minor they put down here in Siam. So now they have 3 minor complexes on the mainland to produce 3 units apiece. And then the 3 new tanks that they purchased, they put in the complex that was already down in Shanghai. So Japan's definitely starting to crank on some, at least the ability to put some ground units in on the Asian mainland. And they ferried. They had 4 transports outside Tokyo, so they were ferrying some men around and doing quite a bit, kind of relaying men up and down the Asian coast there. So they're in pretty good shape. Up here in these northern territories, like I said, the Communist Chinese are all but dead. The National Chinese didn't do a whole heck of a lot because of the fact that Japan had also taken Burma on their turn. Szechuan was then in danger, so they had to pull that big stack of guys back to protect that. So not a whole heck of a lot National China did. And that's pretty much it for the Japanese. And again, they're collecting $55 plus bonuses. Also because they had used their sneak attacks on this last round, they were able to collect a $35 one-time bonus once they do use their sneak attack. So Japan's sitting pretty on a nice stack of money for the next turn. As far as the Far East Command, again, there was really nothing left that they could do. They got a man stranded here in Borneo. They lost everything else except for the combined British and Far East Command fleet. So they came over from just outside of Bombay, came into this sea zone outside of Calcutta, and the Japanese had 4 cruisers, 4 destroyers, 2 subs, and 2 transports. And for the loss of 2 destroyers and 2 subs, they wiped out that complete Japanese Navy. So that was a really good battle for the British and the Far East Command. And they still have quite a bit left. They still got 2 battleships, 2 cruisers, a carrier with a tactical. And if you kind of look here in the South Pacific, the Japanese really don't have much of a navy anywhere. They do have a couple battleships and a couple of cruisers over here, 3 destroyers here, some transports spread out, and a couple destroyers up there. They do have 2 loaded carriers outside of the Carolines, but they're kind of out of position. So I'm assuming the Japanese are going to go ahead and try to take out this Navy, this combination British Far East Command Navy on the next turn, on turn 3. They also have a bunch of air fighters, veteran fighters, and a bomber in Siam. So they should be able to do that. But at least the British were able to take a big chunk of the Japanese Navy out before they possibly die. As far as Anzac, they didn't really do much. The Japanese had come over and taken out their 1 transport over here, so these guys are kind of stranded on these islands. They saved most of their money, although they did buy 1 transport because they still have a decent Navy down here. And with the Japanese Navy being so degraded by the battle over by Bombay, or by Calcutta, Anzac's figuring that maybe they're going to be able to start using this transport on the next turn and moving some guys around and taking some of these other islands up, at least while the Japanese are still relatively weak in naval units in this part of the Pacific. And as far as the U.S. goes, they had, I believe, $36 to spend, and they bought a transport and 2 cruisers. And the reason why they did that is because Japan has now used their sneak attacks. So the U.S. doesn't have to be fearful of building up a navy over here and having Japan choose that navy as a battle to use their sneak attack, which the U.S. would be severely degraded in terms of their ability to respond because of the Japanese sneak attack. So now that they don't have to worry about sneak attacks, the U.S. feels free to go ahead and build up a navy in the Pacific, which, again, if you take a look, it's pretty devoid of Japanese ships. So the U.S. already has a decent navy. They got 3 cruisers, a battleship, a couple of transports, a sub, and a destroyer off of San Francisco. So the U.S. spent their money all on naval units in the Pacific. And then over on the European side here, they continued to move the Navy that they had taken from the Hawaiian Islands up through the Panama Canal, and now we're over by the Caribbean islands. So 1 or 2 sea zones away from being backed by Washington, D.C. As you can see, that's going to be a pretty decent Navy along with the units that are already outside of Washington. So the U.S. will looking on having a couple of fleets here, one on the European side and one on the Pacific side of the map. And then as far as the U.S. rolls, I believe they rolled a 13, but then because of the Japanese attack on the Western Allies, that was a 25 bonus for the U.S., so the U.S. is now up to 52. So they're at 52 of the 80 that they need to be at to declare war themselves. The Russians are at 22 of the 48 they need to be at to declare war, although I don't think you'll see that be a factor as far as the Russians go, because they're not going to, on a 12-sided die, even if they rolled 212, that's only 24 plus 22, that's 46. They still wouldn't be able to declare war themselves at the end of this next turn, and I'm assuming by turn 4, Germany will be attacking the Russians. So that probably won't come into play. The U.S., though, depending on any good rolls or additional events that trigger the U.S. to have an increase, the U.S. actually might be able to get into the conflict before they're actually attacked, but we'll see how that goes. So that's where things stand at the end of round 2. We'll see you at the end of round 3. Turn 3 is now in the books for this Global War 39 solo game. And the game continues to go the Axis way. Things are, the Allies are in a little bit of a bad spot here. Starting off with Germany. Germany held off on declaring war on Russia this last turn, turn 3. So now going into turn 4, they're still peaceful. I think that's about to end. The Germans continued to build a bunch of units here in Romania. All this stuff that's even bleeding over into the Black Sea is all in Romania itself. So you've got a stack of about 10 guys, about 5 mechs, 3 tanks, or probably about a half a dozen regular tanks, 1 Tiger tank that's over here, some artillery, a fighter. So yeah, I think the dam's about to break on the Soviet Union, and they don't have a lot. They've got a single guy in each territory, kind of slow the Germans down. But that's about it in southern Russia. Here in the central part of what's going to be the Russian front, the Germans continue to move stuff over. They've got some men, some mechs, tanks, artillery, all in Warsaw, ready to come over. Up here in Finland, the Russians didn't go back into that one Finnish territory. The Germans have just built up so much. They brought a couple guys over on this transport. And again, they've got their entire Air Force there that it's just kind of going back and forth. The Russians did buy a KV-2 heavy tank and half a dozen regular tanks that they did put in Karelia. So they do have quite a strong force up here in Karelia. But it's kind of offset by the German air power. And with the dam about to break on the rest of the Soviet Union here, I'm not sure the Russians have the luxury of continuing to build stuff up there. And as a matter of fact, they're probably going to have to move that stuff to counterattack what the Germans are throwing at them in central and southern Russia. The Germans also built 5 more subs and put them outside of Stettin. They moved their a little bit of a navy they have here, a coastal battleship, a regular battleship, and a cruiser over outside of Normandy, which does have a naval base, so they can move a 3rd spot. And they're doing a bunch of convoying. These 3 docks here in the Atlantic are all convoyed, and they also have another 4 subs down here. So the Germans actually have a pretty decent naval presence in the Atlantic. And as you can see, the British have absolutely no ships at all. The Atlantic has been completely wiped out, completely devoid of any British ships at all. As you can see over here, this Italian battleship is damaged, and there was a large Italian fleet, like right here in Sea Zone 34, and that was a big naval battle. The British came up from outside of Brazil here, came up 2 spaces, and it was pretty much an even match. The British did lose everything, and the only thing the Italians had left was this cruiser and this damaged battleship. So it wasn't too bad. I mean, the British thought that they didn't have a whole lot left on the board. Possibly they could have came over and made a run for it over here by the American coast, and kind of combined with the American fleet as protection, but also didn't want this big Italian fleet just sitting out here ready to pounce on possibly the Americans when they enter the war either. So the British basically sacrificed the rest of their fleet, came up. Like I said, it was about an even engagement. They took a lot off the Italians. Besides that, the British didn't do a whole heck of a lot else. They continued to beef up in Cairo. But as you can see, Cairo surrounded. The Italians made a few different moves. Other than that, the British didn't do a whole heck of a lot. They continued to build into South Africa, and they built some more fighters. So they got a nice 6 fighters in Cairo. They're moving up into Africa here, Central Africa. They took Italian Somaliland, so that took $2 off of Italy. Other than that, not a whole heck of a lot from the British. Again, the Russians, all their builds went up into Karelia, and they're just kind of waiting the German onslaught here. They did move their fleet up here. They're trying to get it out of range of the Germans. The thinking with moving this Russian fleet over to begin with was they were hoping to combine with British fleet and beef up maybe some Britain's defenses in the Atlantic, but obviously with no English ships at all in the Atlantic, that Russian fleet's just kind of running for their lives, so to speak, trying to stay out of range of the German U-boats and whatnot. As far as Italy, they had a pretty good turn. They lost, again, most of the Navy they had here, but in return they took out the British. The one cruiser that was left came down here and just killed 2 British transports. The British had brought over these guys to Rio de Oro, so now they're in a position with these 4 men. They can start, even just one territory at a time, moving in and taking some of these territories from Germany and maybe getting into the fight a little bit, coming from behind to these Italian African territories. And then the battleship moved back 1 space to take advantage of this naval base, so that'll be the repairs on that'll be fixed. So that'll be a fully functional battleship again. They brought a couple of subs over. They bought 3 destroyers and 3 men. The 3 men they put down in Tobruk, the 3 destroyers over here outside Rome. And then they made a few different moves. They had a couple of transports here, as well as a couple of transports outside of Rome. And they moved some stuff down into here. They landed in Upper Egypt. They landed over here. So now they landed in Syria. So they picked up about $4 worth of territories and kind of got the British surrounded. Now, the Italian units in both territories that are surrounding Cairo, neither one is strong enough on its own to survive what the British can throw, but then you're drawing those British units out of Cairo. And the Italians do have these 4 transports, so they could land in Cairo from the sea. They don't have to come by land. So giving the English a little bit to think about up there in northern Africa. That was about it on the European side, besides the U.S. So the U.S. starting to split their money a little bit between Europe and the Pacific. They built some artillery and a couple more transports. So the U.S. has a pretty decent fleet over here. They got 4 transports, a loaded carrier, 3 destroyers, a sub, a battleship, and a cruiser. And then for the 4 transports, they've got 4 artillery and 4 men that can come over right away. So trying to build up a little bit of Navy and a little bit of ground units that they're able to transport into the conflict once they are in, which will probably be this turn 4, the latest turn 5. Although, again, the Germans do have a bunch of U-boats in the Atlantic lurking around to possibly disrupt those U.S. plans. Over here in the Pacific, things slowed down a little bit. As you remember, Calcutta fell on turn 2. The Japanese came over with a couple battleships, a couple cruisers, a bunch of planes, I think a couple destroyers maybe, and took out the remaining combo Far East Command British fleet that was outside Calcutta. They lost everything, and both battleships are damaged for the Japanese, but again, they're in a sea zone with a naval port, so both of those will be fully repaired this turn. Continue to back the National Chinese up a little bit. They did land in a couple of the Money Islands, so they're starting to take those. As you can see, there's no Allied ships at all here in the South Pacific, so the Japanese will be able to do a little bit of island hopping and start taking all of these Money Islands here pretty quick. They bought mechs, 3 mechs each to put in these 2 minor complexes, and they also started building up another fleet. They put 5 destroyers and a couple of subs down. They've got to counteract what the U.S. has coming here in a few minutes, or maybe a few turns, so to speak. So we'll see how that goes for Japan. National China does still have a big stack of guys in Szechuan, but other than that, Japan's starting to make some headway, and they have these 3 minor complexes on the Asian mainland, so that's 9 units a turn they can put right into Asia without having to worry about transporting them over. So I think the tide is going to start turning a little bit here for the National Chinese. The Russians up here, they moved some tanks down into the Vladivostok with the fortress and just continue to move these men and these artillery pieces over. Potential clash looming between Russia and Japan up there. The Anzac, they came down here a little bit. Now they want to stay out of range of this Japanese fleet up here. The Japs have 2 loaded carriers, and then in the sea zone next door, they have 5 destroyers. They didn't want to come up along northern Australia. They want to avoid that fleet, so they're trying to come down here around the southern part of Australia, get this transport they got with these couple of guys, and maybe land and activate some of these Money Islands for themselves. So that's kind of Australia's thinking right now, but they don't have a whole lot of help in the Pacific, so not sure that's going to work, but we'll see. And then as far as the U.S., they, again, put about half their build here in the Pacific outside of San Francisco. So again, building up a pretty decent fleet. We got a couple of transports, a destroyer, a sub, a loaded carrier, a battleship, and 3 cruisers. So the U.S. hopefully will be getting into the game here, and they can start putting that fleet to good use. That was the reason why Japan had started building up their own second fleet up here in the Japanese home waters to counteract what the U.S. has got. So that's where we stand at the end of turn 3. Not really sure how successful the Allies are going to be the rest of this game. I mean, things will obviously play out here in Russia, especially. The Germans are definitely going to attack Russia here on turn 4, and they've got a massive amount of stuff down here in Romania and even a decent force in Warsaw. And again, the Russians basically are devoid of almost any kind of significant units through southern and central Russia. It's not until you get to Karelia, really up north, that they have anything of any substantial value. So I think the Russians are going to be hurting here pretty quick. And the British they've got their own trouble. They have no navy to speak of. So I don't think the British can really lend a hand. They've got all they can do just to hold off the Italians in North Africa. And the U.S., again, I don't think this turn 4, they're at $59, so they still can't declare war themselves. So I don't think the Japanese or the Germans will be attacking them this turn. So that means the U.S. won't get in for another turn after that. So, and I think by then it might be a little bit too late. The Russians did have a good roll this last turn. They got 2 12s, actually. So they jumped up from 22 to 46 for their income. But that's not going to matter. They're too short of being able to declare war themselves, but they're about to get attacked. So that's going to bring them fully into the conflict. So we'll see. Maybe the Allies can turn things around. A lot will depend on success or lack thereof, of this German invasion of Russia here on turn 4. So we'll see it at the end of this turn. Okay, folks, turn 4 is in the books, and I think the Allies have a little bit of life left in them. There was definitely some bad at the beginning of turn 4. Germany's move to start the turn, but other than that, actually some good stuff came out for the Allies. So if we look over in Russia, the dam did break, and the Germans did come into Russia. And as you can see, especially in southern Russia, massive attack from Romania. They're down into western Ukraine. There's a huge stack of men, tanks, mechs, Tiger tank. And the Germans put down some more units in Romania following up. More tanks, mechs, and another Tiger. So there's not a whole lot down in southern Russia, just some men scattered in each of the territories. So Russia's definitely hurting in southern Russia. On the central part of the front, the Germans came in through East Poland, and they went ahead and took a bunch of the border territories there with the Russians. Up north, they had taken Leningrad and Murmansk as well. So Germany was sitting pretty at the end of their combat phase. They also put some more men into Paris, built another 5 subs, brought these 4 subs over, and continued to spread their submarines that are already in the Atlantic out further. So a good turn for Germany. They went ahead and brought most of the aircraft they used in combat back to Helsinki, although they did fly the 2 bombers down to Romania. So Germany was sitting at around $72 plus bonuses. And again, they've just got a massive force, especially in southern and central Russia. But the Russians fought back. They bought 11 men in a fortress, and they put the fortress and 10 of the men down in Moscow. And then they did launch a few attacks. They took Leningrad back. They took Murmansk back. They took this one Finnish territory bordering Helsinki. And they still have quite a bit in Karelia. So the Russians fought back as best they could. I mean, it still looks kind of bleak for Russia, but not too bad. They also came down here and took Iraq, which not only did that give them $2, but there were 3 Iraqi infantry that the Italians would have been able to pick up the next turn. So they denied Italy those 3 guys. So that was big. Out in the Pacific, Russia was thinking about attacking into Japan, but they didn't want to leave Vladivostok defenseless. And the Japanese got a bunch of transports and men that they could have landed in Vladivostok. So went ahead and decided not to attack Japan. They consolidated a bunch of stuff here in this Russian territory right on the border with Japan. So definitely can expect a clash probably between the Japanese and the Russians next turn. As far as the British go, they had a really good turn. They went ahead. The Germans had a coastal battleship, a battleship, and a cruiser here. And the British attacked with their 6 fighters. And for the cost of 2 fighters, they took out all 3 German ships. So that was huge. So now the Germans only have submarines left as far as a naval force goes, besides this one lone destroyer that's convoying. So big time battle for the British there. They also came down in Africa, moved up a territory, and took Morocco, so that was worth $1. And then they also got some really good rolls and some good results from a couple of battles over here in Africa. They came over to Transjordan and took out the Italians there, so they got that $1 back, and I think they took out like 2 or 3 infantry, a tank, and an artillery. Then they came over here to Upper Egypt and took out a couple of tanks, a man, and a couple of mechs. They also continue to move units up from South Africa, making their way up. You got 3 mechs here, a couple tanks, and a couple of men here as well. And as you can see, the Italians have almost nothing left in Africa. It's all infantry. So, and the British continue to put money into North Africa. They bought 3 more tanks and a couple of fighters they put down here in South Africa. So right now the balance of power is totally tilted in Britain's favor, and with the Russians having shut off Italian access to the Mideast here by taking Iraq, Italy's in a little bit of trouble. So the British really helped out the Allied cause on this turn. Again, it still looks like in Europe, Germany's got a stranglehold on the Russians right now. I don't know if the British or the Americans are going to be able to get over to Russia before, or assist too much before the Germans are too deep into Russia for it to make a difference. But at least in Africa, and then taking out that German Navy was huge. The Italians, because of having lost so much in Upper Egypt and Transjordan, they just pulled back. They built all men, put 3 guys in this minor complex in Tobruk, and then put 7 guys in Rome. They had 4 transports sitting outside of Cairo. They all pulled back a couple of spaces. So they're going to be in a position the next turn to go 1 and then 2 more, since they're at a naval base now, to pick up all these guys that they just purchased and maybe land back in Africa. The Italians over here, this battleship that was damaged was repaired because of the naval base. And then they came out and they convoyed this British box for 2 and this U.S. box for 5. So now if you look at the Atlantic between the Germans and the Italians, 5 convoy boxes right now for a total of $16 off of the Allies. So that's pretty big. And the reason why the Italians came into this U.S. convoy box is the U.S. Between the German invasion of Russia, which gave the U.S. 10 extra points towards their war footing, and then their die roll, they're now at war. So no attacks came from the U.S. They still had to confine themselves to U.S. territories because they weren't at war when their turn started. But at the end of the turn, the U.S. is now in the war. So it is a true global conflict now, and all the major belligerents are in the conflict. As far as in the Pacific, Japan has been moving stuff up north because they can see the Russians gathering all this stuff on their border. So the Japanese went ahead. They bought a Yamato battleship. It's turn 4. They're able to start purchasing those now. They purchased a carrier, 3 more destroyers, and some men. So now they've got a handful of transports up around the Japanese home islands to start ferrying men over. Like I said, I'm assuming that a conflict between Russia and Japan is going to take place on turn 5 here. The Japanese did also they had the national Chinese down to just 1 territory, but as you can see, the Chinese counterattacked and took a couple of those territories back. So national China's got 3 territories worth of units in it. Communist China is down to just a single man and a single territory, but the Japanese don't have a whole lot of ground units in China. Again, they've been putting a lot of units this last turn, moving them up north to deal with a possible confrontation with Russia. So that's kind of left China, giving them a little bit of a breather. The Japanese lost a couple tanks and a couple of veteran infantry when the Chinese counterattacked. So I mean, it still looks like Japan does have the upper hand in China, but I don't think the Chinese are going to go away, at least with it for a few more turns at least. Japan did start moving out more into India, taking these empty territories away, so picking up a couple of bucks there. The 2 battleships they had outside of Calcutta were repaired because of the naval base, and then they just consolidated a fleet over here. So over by the Caroline Islands, they got a couple of loaded carriers and 4 destroyers. And that's about it for Japan. Besides dealing with a possible confrontation with Russia, they're also trying to build up a nice fleet in Japan itself because of the coming conflict with the U.S. and the U.S. fleet that they're building off of San Francisco. So that was about it for Japan and China. The Australians were able to come over down here south of Australia, move a couple of sea zones, and take one of these money islands. So that was worth $3 to them. Plus they gained the two infantry that were there. So that wasn't too bad for Australia. And they also went ahead and upgraded their factory from a minor to a major. And they're up to $16 plus bonuses. So they're kind of hanging in there a little bit. And then as far as the U.S., they spent money on a couple of transports and a handful of men in San Francisco, and then 4 destroyers in the eastern U.S. So now that the U.S. is officially at war, they can start moving this fleet, which consists of 4 transports, a sub, a destroyer, 3 cruisers, a battleship, a loaded carrier, and they have about a half a dozen men and an artillery piece that they can start moving. So definitely giving Japan something to think about in the Pacific. As far as in the eastern half of the United States, they put the 4 destroyers they built down here. And they have to do that because, as you can see again, not only are there German and Italian subs convoying all up down through the Atlantic, the Germans also have a couple of subs over here and a couple of subs outside of England. They've got 4 subs over here by Normandy. And then the Germans had built 5 more subs that are currently outside of Stettin. So the U.S. Needed to build some destroyers, just try to start taking out some of these Axis subs to get the money back from these convoys. So altogether, this U.S. fleet consists of 6 or 7 destroyers, 4 transports, a battleship, a sub, a cruiser, and a loaded carrier. And again, the U.S. does have some units that they can transport on those transports already. They've got about 4 or 5 guys and 4 artillery pieces. So the U.S. thinking is they're going to try to land in Europe as soon as possible, but the first step is going to be to clear out all these subs. Also, the Russian fleet that was hanging up north, again, what this fleet is trying to do is it's trying to rendezvous with some Allied ships, and obviously there's no British ships even on the board, at least in the Atlantic. So they're trying to make their way over to the U.S. and combine with that fleet and stay out of range of the German U-boats. So that's over here by Canada. That'll be in a position maybe they'll arrive at a sea zone with the United States here on the next turn. So altogether, as far as money goes, Japan at 76, the U.S. is at 75 because they lost the $5 for that convoy. Germany at 67, Russia at 50. Britain at 38, Italy at 28, and Anzac at 16, and National China at 7. So altogether, I think that Axis still have quite a bit of an advantage right now, but especially those British moves in Africa and then taking out that German fleet, along with a little bit of a couple of pinprick attacks from China back at the Japanese in China itself, I think really helped. So I think there's a little bit of a glimmer of light for the Allies. We'll see how things go at the end of turn 5. Okay, folks, we just completed turn 5 here in Global War 39. And I think the Allies are pretty much ready to concede. We're going to go ahead and play probably at least one more. Well, definitely one more, maybe even a couple more turns. But at this point, it looks like the writing is on the wall. We're 5 turns in, and I don't really see much hope for an Allied victory at this point. If we kind of take a look at Europe, the Allies did do a couple of good things this turn. The U.S. Came into the conflict this past turn, so they've started to make their presence felt a little bit, but I just think it's a little bit too late for the Allies. So if we take a look here in Europe, Germany's got a stranglehold basically on the continent from the Atlantic and France all the way to deep into Russia. If we take a look over in Western Europe, they got a stack of about a dozen men and a half a dozen tanks in Paris, and the Allies have like nothing that's even remotely close to coming onto the continent. So that right there is enough to repel a Allied invasion to begin with, let alone an invasion's probably several turns away. So Western Europe is secure. Germans also placed 10 more subs that they purchased here in Stettin. So the Atlantic improved a little bit for the Allies, which we'll get into here in a minute. But the Germans are cranking out subs like crazy right now. There's no danger of an invasion of Europe, so they don't have to worry about the defenses there. And in Russia, we'll take a closer look here at that. They're pretty much secure with what they've got there. So basically all their money is they're pumping into subs right now. As far as Russia itself goes, as you can see, the Germans are just about at Moscow. They're about one territory away from Moscow. In southern Russia, the Germans are totally running wild. The Germans and their allies, a couple territories, the Russians have a single man, and that's all that's left. I mean, look at this stack of about 10 mechs, 10 regular tanks, a couple of Tigers, a bunch of allied Germany allied units coming, mechs, tanks, men, artillery. I mean, there's just nothing down there. The Germans got to bust through Kursk, and then Kharkov here, and then it's just they can run down into the Caucasus, they can get Stalingrad. I mean, there's just nothing left. In northern Russia, the Russians are hanging on a little bit better. Karelia still has a stack of men, and the British did bring over 5 fighters to assist with Russian defense. The Russians took Murmansk back, and the Germans really don't have a lot left in Finland. They just have 2 guys, 1 each in 2 territories, and that's it. But the bad news for Russia is they came into Leningrad. They had 2 men, 6 tanks, 4 fighters, and a tactical. And the Germans had 4 tanks and I believe 6 mechs. And on the first roll, the Russians did take out 4 mechs. But altogether, the combat lasted 2 rounds before the Russians pulled back, and the Germans lost altogether 5 mechs, but took out both infantry and 5 of the 6 Russian tanks. When the Germans rolled for their 4 tanks, all 4 hit. So instead of pressing the attack and losing any of their aircraft, the Russians pulled back. So not only did they not retake Leningrad and the 2 bucks there, but the Germans still have, the 4 tanks and 1 of the mechs. So that definitely wasn't good. The planes then flew back to Moscow for builds. The Russians put 10 infantry down in Moscow, so there's about 20 infantry there, along with 3 artillery, a heavy tank, a tactical, and 4 fighters. And then they put 7 more infantry in Karelia. So the Germans in central and northern Russia don't have a ton of units. They do have a big air force down here, just outside of the Baltic states. But again, Russia really has nothing until you get to Moscow, like a single man here, a single man there. So even just a little bit of German forces are going to be able to punch through. I expect on turn 6 here, Germany's opening move, that they're going to take Western Russia, Kursk, and Kharkov, and have 3 territories adjacent right to Moscow. So I'm assuming that on turn 7, then, looking ahead a little bit, the Germans will probably assault Moscow. The Russians will probably put down another 10 infantry. So at that point, it'd be about 30 infantry, a handful of fighters, and a few artillery. But look at all that Germany will have, like at the, to be able to go into Moscow with in 2 turns. Not to mention there's more stuff coming from Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. The German Air Force is still intact. So it looks like, if you want to peek into the future a little bit, turn 7 looks like when the assault on Moscow will begin, and the odds right now, I think, favor Germany, but we'll see. The Russians do have a little bit of opening here, since they took Murmansk back, and with really no German units left in Finland, they can bust free into maybe Norway here and take that $5 bonus away from Germany at least. As far as the British, they didn't do a whole lot in Europe. They did take their 5 fighters and move them over to Karelia to back up the Russians. But again, they have no naval units on the board in the Atlantic, and there's just not any sense. I mean, the British are only getting about $40 a turn. So even if they sunk it all into naval units, you're only talking about 6 destroyers maybe. And just look at all the German subs around. I mean, there's 5 there outside of Normandy. There's 10 more coming from Stettin. There's a handful spread out through the Atlantic convoying. So, I mean, those destroyers would get picked off right away. So until maybe the U.S. can come to Britain's defense, really no sense in the British player putting down any naval units at this point. So they really didn't spend any money in Europe, although at least the Germans have no transports on the board except for a single one outside Stettin. So there's also no danger anytime soon of the British Isles being invaded. As far as the Russian fleet, it came down here outside of Nova Scotia. And then on the U.S. turn, they moved stuff up there. So now you've got a combined U.S.-Russian fleet outside of Nova Scotia. So that's looking pretty good. And the U.S. did bring some transports. They got 4 transports, a bunch of men and artillery ready to either maybe land in England or possibly France this next turn, although I don't think that seems likely. And then that combined naval force is pretty strong. You got a couple of battleships, a couple of cruisers, a couple of destroyers, a sub, a loaded carrier. So that's not too bad. What the U.S. did do that helped out a lot was there was a stack of 7 German subs here, and the U.S. brought out a bunch of destroyers, a fighter, and a sub. And for the loss of a single sub, they took out all 7 German submarines. So the Germans still have, along with the Italians, still have all these convoy boxes being convoyed with a single sub each. But they did take out that, like I said, they did take out those 7 subs. So that looks, the Atlantic looks a little bit better for the U.S. as far as trying to bring stuff over. They also bought 10 destroyers this turn and put them all down here outside of Washington. Because the first step for the U.S., if they want to have any hope of being able to land in Europe and kind of take some pressure off of Russia, is they've got to clear the Atlantic of all these German subs. And it's kind of a race. Like I said, you got the 10 German subs from Stettin that are going to be coming over. So it's kind of a race to see who can build, the U.S. building destroyers, the Germans building subs, and see who. Because obviously, as the U.S., you're not going to try to bring over a bunch of transports across the Atlantic when the Germans got, a dozen or more subs sitting there. You got to clear those subs out first. So we'll see how that goes. In Africa, the British continue to make some headway. They had taken Alexandria back. They took this territory here, so we're kind of at the doorstep of Tobruk. But on Italy's turn, they counterattacked, took Alexandria back, moved a guy down here in Cyrenaica, so that the British are now blocked off from being able to get to Tobruk on this next turn. The Italians also brought their transports with men, landed in Corinth and Crete, took those 2, and then landed the rest of their men from the transports in Alexandria, and that's where they counterattacked there. So it's still kind of a race, although the British do have a stack of fighters and some, probably about 8 fighters and 3 tanks in Cairo. And now maybe the Italians don't really have a lot protecting these transports, so maybe an opening for the Italians or the British to take out those Italian transports. They also moved a couple of transports the British did up here. So now the thinking with the British is they're going to try to make their way back into India a little bit. As you can see, the Japanese don't really have anything in India hardly at all. It's all a bunch of vacant territories for the most part. So the British are going to try to make their way back through the Middle East into India, bring these transports up here, maybe land in India next turn. They also have a transport and a couple men down in South Africa they can start moving over. So that's how things kind of look in Europe. Over in the Pacific side, Japan continues to run wild. As you can see, there's a huge part of the Pacific Ocean and the Asian Indian mainland that's got roundels of the rising sun on it. And Japan is really in complete control on this side of the map. A couple things going on that might present some problems, but China's down to a single territory, national China. Same thing with communist China. I'm expecting both of those to fall this next turn to completely wipe the Chinese out. Japan will probably start building some stuff down here in Siam to maybe counterattack the British starting to come over a little bit. In the South Pacific, they've started taking the Money Islands. They took out this Australian fleet that was here. So now these Australian infantry are just stranded on these islands. Japan's going to probably, they took the Philippines, probably start moving some of these guys with these transports around, and trying to get all these Money Islands. Australia pulled back the remnants of a fleet they had down here south of Australia, and they built some fighters last turn. So they got a decent defense force, and Japan really isn't close to landing in Australia anyways. So Australia will probably hang on for a while longer, but no transports. And with the Japanese getting more of a naval presence in the South Pacific, I don't really see Australia really venturing anywhere. They're probably just going to kind of turtle up and sit in Australia. So not dying off, but not really helping either. The U.S., again, they got into it this last turn, so they moved this fleet down here. They've got 4 transports, 5 men, an artillery, a loaded carrier, 3 cruisers, a destroyer, a battleship, and a sub. And Japan really doesn't have anything on this side of the Pacific. So the U.S. has got this fleet down here. Maybe they're going to start picking off some of these islands for themselves. The Caroline Islands has only got a single Japanese infantry there. So give the Japanese something to think about. Maybe take some pressure off of the Russians, which we'll look at in a second. Besides that, the U.S., besides their 10 destroyers they bought and they put on the East Coast, they went ahead and bought 2 bombers to give themselves some offensive punch in the Pacific. And then as far as the Russians, they came into this Japanese territory here. So they've got 3 artillery, about 6 men, and 3 tanks. So they've got much more just in that one territory than Japan really does have up here in northern Asia. The Japanese did try to take Vladivostok this last turn and got pretty much crushed. They had to pull their remaining aircraft back, and Vladivostok is still Russian. So the Russians can make a little bit of headway here. The problem is that Japan is collecting $83 minus bonuses right now. So if it's a race between Japan building up units to counterattack the Russians here, they're going to win that because they've got so much money. And they do have these 3 transports here that can bring stuff over if they put it in Tokyo. They also have this minor complex here in Peking that they can put units down. So for now, the Russians are going to make a little bit of headway, maybe another turn or 2. But then after that, I definitely see the tide turning against the Russians. And they really don't have, with Moscow being threatened here, they really don't have the resources to spend here in Novosibirsk to buy new units to back up what they've already started doing here in Asia. So I think it's just going to be a temporary victory for Russia, but we'll see. Japan really doesn't have a whole heck of a lot as far as ground units in the Asian mainland, although they do have the 3 complexes, so they can start putting stuff down there. But with the U.S. now in the conflict and get involved a little bit with this naval force coming down, maybe Japan starts thinking about building up more of a navy. They did buy another carrier with a fighter and a tactical and another Yamato battleship. So altogether over here on the Japanese home waters, they got 2 Yamato battleships, 2 loaded carriers, about 8 destroyers and 2 subs. So they have a decent navy as it is, and they definitely have the income to keep spending there. As far as the economics go, again, it looks pretty bleak for the Allies. So you've got Japan at 83 and Germany at 76, and they're the top 2 economic powers. The U.S. is down to 68 because of the loss of the Philippines, and they're getting convoyed a couple of places. Russia's at 42, Britain's at 39, Italy's 28, Anzac is standing at 16, and then China's down to just 5. So again, I think it's pretty much over for the Allies. Definitely going to play turns 6 and 7, and we'll see at that point. I think China is going to get finished off by Japan this turn, and then Russia will be all but done by turn 7. But we'll play it out a little bit longer and see how it goes. So turn 6 is in the books, and things have turned around a little bit here. I'm not so sure the Axis got this all sewn up. The biggest thing going on, and probably what's going to determine the game, is over here in Russia. Moscow, a couple of territories Germany's got adjacent to Moscow, so turn 7 here is going to see the attack on Moscow itself. But the Russians got 30 infantry, 8 fighters, 3 artillery, and a heavy tank. The British brought their 4 fighters over to bolster Moscow's defenses, and the Germans made a little bit of a mistake. The last couple of turns, they've been spending all their money in the west. They bought a bunch of subs, and they also pulled back about half of their air force that they had based in Romania thinking that Moscow was definitely going to fall and they didn't need to put any more resources into the east. And it's going to be a close run thing here. The Germans are going to be able to attack Moscow with 18 mechs, 13 regular tanks, 7 infantry, 3 artillery, 2 Tiger tanks, 3 fighters, and 2 Stukas. So it's 48 units for Germany, 42 for Russia, and the total attack strength of the German units is 190. The total defense strength of the Russian units is 197. So it's probably about a 50-50 prospect right now. And as you can see, if Moscow does fall, the Russians have nothing to take it back with. So the game will tilt heavily in the Axis favor. On the other hand, if Russia holds on to Moscow, the Germans have almost nothing else in Russian territory at all, and they have nothing coming from any of the factories they have either. The one in Romania or the one here in Stettin has no units. So the Germans will have to build stuff this turn, and then it would take a couple of turns to get to Moscow after that. And by then, you figure the Russians have built 10 infantry or so a turn there. So this really is probably going to determine the game, depending on which way Moscow goes. Besides that, in the Atlantic, it's been a kind of a back and forth. The Germans came out, destroyed a bunch of U.S. destroyers, and the U.S. came back and destroyed the subs with the destroyers they had off the east coast here of the United States. This Russian and U.S. Fleet still off of Nova Scotia. They're trying to clear out these subs before they make their way over, so we'll see how that goes. In Africa, the British were able to use their fighters and take out all the Italian transports. But then Italy built a couple of transports this last turn to start moving guys around again. And in North Africa, it looks about even. Keep going back and forth a little bit. Both Cairo and Tobruk are fairly heavily defended. So not sure how that's going to play out. The British did come over and they landed back in India. They brought some units through the Middle East, and they also used a couple of transports they had here in Africa to bring men over. So they've taken back 2 territories from the Japanese in India. And as you can see, kind of like with the Germans in Russia, there's almost no Japanese units throughout Asia itself. The Japanese did get China down to just 2 infantry units and 2 territories, 1 each, and China's almost out of the game. Russia came in up here in northern Asia. They came in and they got 3 tanks, 3 artillery, and 3 infantry in this Japanese territory here. Japan responded by building some tanks, and they also put some men in Tokyo, and they've got these 3 transports here. So I don't think, with the Japanese reacting to what Russia's doing, I don't think Russia's got enough units over here to hold off what Japan's going to throw at them. The Russians did build a couple of mechs and an artillery here in Novosibirsk, and they're thinking about coming down here and coming into these Chinese territories and maybe taking up some of this money from Japan. Down in the Pacific, Japan's got a couple of navies, one off of the Philippines, one off of one of these money islands down here. Australia continued to just kind of turtle up. They built a few more fighters. They got a stack of about 8 fighters there. And then the U.S. fleet that was down here in the South Pacific moved back up to Hawaii. They saw these 2 Japanese fleets down here, so they kind of pulled back. And they built a few destroyers to add to this fleet in Hawaii. As far as Japan and what they can do to counteract what the British are doing, they'll probably bring these 3 tanks down from Szechuan. They can move 2 spaces, so they'll hit Calcutta. So they'll be in Calcutta before Britain gets to go again. And they also have some transports with a couple of odd infantry units here that they can bring over. 1, 2, 3 from this naval base. So they should be able to beef up Calcutta enough because Britain really doesn't have a whole lot coming. 3 tanks and like 2 infantry can make it this next turn. So that's probably not enough to take out what Japan will put down there this next turn. And then Japan will also probably start putting units in Siam and this minor factory too, start going over to India too. So it might be a little bit too little too late for the Allies in the Pacific as far as what Britain's doing over here in India and what the Russians are doing here in northern Asia. I think maybe Japan's going to be able to hold off and start putting units down in the 3 industrial complexes they have on the Asian mainland. And the U.S. still hasn't presented enough of a threat in the Pacific with this fleet. Like I said, the Japanese got a couple of fleets down in the South Pacific, and they built another Yamato and another loaded carrier in the Japanese home water. They also went ahead and started convoying a couple of U.S. boxes for $10 there. So I think the Pacific is still very much got a Japanese stranglehold on it, and they're up to $90 plus bonuses, so they're making all kinds of money to dump more units there. The Germans are at 74. The U.S. is down to 63 because of the convoys and having lost the Philippines. So again, we're heading into turn 7. The Germans did put a bunch of units in Paris. That's part of where the Air Force, they pulled back, and they did buy 3 tacticals. So Paris is well defended. And the German thinking here was, now with this Air Force, they can kind of move out into these Atlantic sea zones near the French coast to destroy U.S. ships, especially if this fleet with the transport starts to make its way over. But again, I think that kind of backfired, because for the last 2 turns now, the Germans haven't put any money into the Eastern Front. It's all been in the West. And now, where it looked like maybe a turn or 2 ago that Moscow would definitely fall with what Germany had bringing in, like I said, now it's about a 50-50 proposition. So we'll see how things go. Again, I think the Pacific is kind of wrapped up for Japan, but if Germany can't take Moscow this turn, then the Allies are going to start making some more headway in Europe and put even more pressure on Japan. So we'll see. I think the game's going to come down to this battle for Moscow, which we're going to get to in turn 7. Okay, folks, turn 7 is in the books in this solo game of Global War 39. And I think the fat lady is sung. I think the party's over for the Allies. Pretty sure this is going to end up being an Axis victory. This is only turn 7, so we're going to play it out a little bit longer, go to at least the completion of turn 10. I believe victory conditions are the Axis have to hold 12 victory cities at the end of turn 10. So we still have, to make it official, we still have 3 turns to go here. But like I said, it would take more than a miracle, I think, at this point for an Allied victory. If you remember from last turn, the big battle was going to be here in Russia. The Germans were coming into Moscow, and they did come in, and they were able to take Moscow. They have a couple of Tigers, a couple of regular Panzers. Those are Panzer Mark IIIs. Those Sculps are for a Panzer Mark III. So they got 4 tanks left, and they also had 5 aircraft, 3 fighters, and 2 tacticals, and they took everything out in Moscow. It was, at first, the first couple of rounds of the combat, it looked like the Russians were actually going to win. The Russians had, I think, 30, maybe 31 infantry, 8 fighters, 4 from the British, and that they had flown over, 4 Russian fighters, like 3 artillery, and a KV-2 heavy tank, along with the Fortress. And the Germans had altogether maybe about 48 total units coming in. And on the first round of combat, the Russians got, I think the Germans got around 10 or 12 hits, and the Russians got like 18 or so. So I actually thought Russia was going to be able to pull it out, but it ended up actually not being that close. Again, the Germans had altogether 9 units still left. So the Germans went ahead and took Moscow. They don't get the money for that. The money is just lost to the bank, and then the Russians are able to declare a second capital, which they went ahead and made Novosibirsk over here in the Far East their second capital. But even though Germany didn't get the money for it, that was about $40, $45 the Russians lost to the bank, and they were obviously unable to buy any units this turn. So the board is pretty devoid of Russian units. They did try to take Leningrad back. They only had like 3 infantry, but there really wasn't much else they could do, and they failed in that attempt. They did take Helsinki, so that was a positive for them. But if you look here in European Russia here, you've got 2 artillery and 1 mech. And that's all Russia has on the board in European Russia. So the Germans don't have a whole heck of a lot left in Russia itself, but obviously it's more than enough to take out that. So Karelia is going to fall on this next German turn. So Russia's pretty much dead on the European side of the board. The Germans did go ahead and they bought 20 mechs. 10 they put in Stettin, 10 they put in Romania, because that was obviously before the actual battle for Moscow. So they wanted to kind of hedge their bets in case they lost that battle, and they could follow it up with some mechs making their way over. But now with Russia pretty much subdued, those mechs can maybe come over into Western Europe and start dealing with the Western allies. Besides that, Germany continues to bulk up in Paris, got a bunch of men, a bunch of Air Force units, a couple bombers, and some tacticals. They did come out with a stack of subs in this lone destroyer, and they took out a stack of, I believe, 7 or 8 U.S. destroyers, and they also moved this stack of 10 subs up from Stettin. So if you kind of look at the Atlantic, there's not much that the U.S. has in the way of destroyers. The U.S. did go and buy 10 new destroyers, and they placed them all here outside of Washington. So the U.S. basically had no choice. They had to spend their entire income on the European side of the map here. And those destroyers they needed, because, like I said, the 7 or 8 destroyers they had left were wiped out, and the Germans still have a bunch of subs in the Atlantic. So the U.S. had no choice but to build all these destroyers. They did move this fleet up here. Now it is currently vulnerable to a German attack, but the U.S. can scramble some fighters. And again, the U.S. really had no choice. Just having this Navy just sitting over here doing nothing. They've got to get in the fight. It's probably, again, too little too late anyways, but they've at least got to try to get into the fight and turn the tide at least a little bit. That was pretty much all the U.S. did. The British, they built 10 men, put them in London. They can kind of see the writing on the wall that an invasion is probably a few turns away still, but inevitably that'll be coming. Besides that, they went ahead here in Africa and bulked up with some more fighters in Cairo. And then they bought a few more fighters they put down here in South Africa. So they got quite the Air Force. They did lose Upper Egypt back to the Italians. And over here on the west coast of Africa, they had 4 infantry that they lost because the Italians brought 4 infantry on a couple of transports down from Rome, along with a bunch of planes that you see here, and wiped out that. So the British really have nothing left in West Africa except for this lone guy who's kind of stuck. He can't move past the Sahara Desert here. That's impassable. So he's kind of stuck there guarding territories that aren't even worth anything. So these couple of territories that are worth $1, the Italians will be taking here on their next turn. Another development that bodes ominously for the Allies is that Leningrad was already under German control, and again, the Russians were repelled trying to take that back. And then with Moscow falling, that meant that Spain then is pro-Axis. You have to, as the Axis, you have to control 2 of the 3 cities between Stalingrad, Moscow, and Leningrad. And if you do, then Spain becomes pro-Axis, and an Axis unit just has to go in there to activate Spain. So, again, with Germany having taken Moscow, that was another reason why the Russians tried to get Leningrad back, is to avoid Spain going pro-Axis. But again, the Russians failed in that. So Italy walked a man over and then got all of that. So that was $3 worth of the Spanish territories, which wasn't even that much of a big deal, $3. But what the big deal was all those units that are now Italian were Spanish. So they got a second fleet built up already, battleship, cruiser, destroyer, transport, coastal sub, and then a bunch of infantry, some planes, a tank, and an artillery. So if things weren't already bad enough for the Allies, Italy now all of a sudden is basically on par with the British. They have actually quite a bit more now in the Mediterranean than the British do, and even income-wise, they're not that far behind. So it looks pretty much to be game over on the European side of the map. Over here in Asia, again, it's much of the same. The Russians did have a couple of territories up here. The Japanese came back, took that back, and wiped out 3 tanks, 3 artillery, and 3 or 4 men. So that really leaves the Russians with almost nothing. They have 2 infantry left in Asia, and that's it. So Vladivostok will fall this turn. All of these Russian territories up here are empty, worth $1 apiece. I'm sure these 2 Russian infantry will get wiped out. Even over here in Novosibirsk, you've got a Japanese infantry and a tank, and then 2 more Japanese tanks that can make it into Novosibirsk this next turn. And the Russians just have the 2 mechs and the 1 artillery. I was thinking about bringing them out and attacking one of these territories, but the odds wouldn't have been in the Russians' favor. Plus, even if they would have came down into this territory here, it doesn't block off these tanks from going 1-2 up into Novosibirsk. So they would have left Novosibirsk completely empty. And again, since Russia had to surrender their money this turn from losing Moscow, they couldn't buy anything to put down there. So they do have money this turn, $40, but Japan goes before they do, so I wouldn't be surprised if Novosibirsk falls before the Russians can even spend any money. And that'll be it for Russia. They only get to move their capital the 1 time. Besides that, Japan came over. The British were closing in on Calcutta. They're right at the doorstep. So the Japanese had counterattacked and taken Madras back as kind of like a blocker so that the British couldn't get to Calcutta this turn. The British came back, took Madras back on their portion of the turn. So now they're at the doorstep of Calcutta, but you see the Japanese got, I think, 2 or 3 fighters and a couple of tactical bombers. No ground units, but they do have 3 fighters in Siam. They're going to fly over before the British get a turn again, so I don't think the British would, with 3 tanks and 3 men, would be able to take Calcutta. So Calcutta will probably hold. Over here, the U.S. and the Australians combined, and they're outside of Dutch New Guinea here. That's about 8 Anzac fighters, an Anzac coastal battleship, and a cruiser, and then the entire U.S. fleet, which is 3 cruisers, a destroyer, a sub, a battleship, a loaded carrier, some transport, some men, and a artillery. Again, probably not going to do a whole heck of a lot because Japan can pretty much concentrate. Since the Asian mainland is almost completely theirs, they can concentrate on just buying naval units and coming down and trying to crush this. But again, the game is pretty much over. So the U.S., the Allies, might as well roll the dice, and instead of just sitting back in Alaska or Australia and sitting back off the west coast of the United States, they might as well get this fleet into the game and try to do at least some damage. Maybe get some good rolls, take out this Japanese fleet that's here, and maybe try to start gobbling up some of the money islands or whatever. It's at least a little bit of a chance that they got. So that's where things look at the end of turn 7. Again, I don't really see any way that the Allies are going to win, but we'll play a couple more turns and see how it turns out. Turn 8 is in the books here. In Global War 39, the Axis continue their march to victory. The Germans moved their mechs up into some of these Russian territories. So they have Russia under control, Russians down to just a couple of infantry. They're in place of vacated territories by the Germans, and 2 artillery pieces and a mech, and that's it. The Germans dropped 20 infantry down this turn, 10 in Western Germany and 10 in Stettin. So starting to build up a possible invasion force for England itself. Other than that, the Germans didn't do a whole heck of a lot. There wasn't much left to do. Again, Russia's pretty much almost completely wiped out, so not a whole heck of a lot for Germany to do. The British went ahead and built 4 fighters they put in London. So they're trying to beef up the defense of the home isles. And then they put 3 men down in Cairo. So they got a stack of about 10, 12 fighters, 3 tanks, and 3 infantry. So they got a pretty strong defense going in Cairo, but with Germany putting so much into a possible invasion of England, there's probably not too many resources the British are going to be putting towards Cairo. So it's going to slowly start to tilt in Italy's favor in the Med. The U.S. went ahead and brought the fleet that was up here down into England. They landed there. Was thinking about going into Russia, but the Germans have way too many resources. It'd just be maybe a turn or two and all this would be wiped out for no reason. And it was just kind of sailing along in the Atlantic, not doing much of anything, so they might as well make for land and drop these forces off in England. At least they can go ahead and help defend England itself. The Germans do have this stack of 10 subs lurking, so they'll probably come over 1, 2 and take out this fleet. Although the U.S. does have 3 fighters here with this air base adjacent to this sea zone and more than 3 fighters here, so they'll be able to scramble all together 6 fighters once the subs make their presence felt firing on this fleet, so maybe they'll be able to take out some subs. Other than that, the U.S. came and cleared 2 convoys, this one here for $3 for Britain and this over here for $3 for Britain, so that gave the British back $6. And the Germans really don't have a lot of subs left in the Atlantic itself. So maybe the stack of U.S. destroyers will be able to take out these remaining Axis subs and clear up those convoy zones, get the money back for that. As far as Italy, they built a stack of men and a couple more transports. So they're going to start moving all these guys around, maybe for an attack on Cairo itself, or maybe landing over here in Syria and making their way into the Mideast. They also came over and liberated, so to speak, Morocco, got the money for that. And they've got a cruiser, a destroyer, and a transport with 2 men over here. Maybe going to start moving them down, maybe into South America, taking this back from the British, or maybe even landing down here and activating Argentina for the Axis. These U.S. destroyers are just out of range to be able to get this Italian mini fleet here, so the Italians will be able to make their way down before the U.S. can get to them, I think. And that's pretty much it for Europe. It was a lot of positioning and moving things around. Again, if you kind of look at Europe as a whole, it's heavily Axis. The Germans got stacks of stuff all over the place now. England is starting to beef up. Maybe on the next turn here, England will buy a fortress for London. But even if they start sinking everything in there, that's basically giving up Africa and kind of turtling. And with how much money the Germans are bringing in, and even Italy starting to bring in a decent amount, it would just be a matter of time. In the Pacific, the Japanese pulled back a fleet over here, so that they weren't in range of the U.S. anymore. They went ahead and built 3 fighters they placed in Siam. They got some transports down here to start moving around. And the big purchases were up in the Japanese home islands. They went ahead and purchased, I think, 3 more transports, another Yamato battleship, and a bunch of men. So as you can see, there's a stack of 6 transports and about a dozen men. So obviously Japan's starting to have designs on possibly coming over here and landing maybe in Alaska. Who knows, maybe even making a play for the west coast of the United States. And they have 3 Yamato battleships up there, a loaded carrier, and some destroyers. And they're making a ridiculous amount of money. The Japanese also took out the last couple of Russian units up here, captured a few Russian territories that were empty. They went ahead and took Novosibirsk and wiped out 3 more Russian units and took the last Russian industrial complex. and that was Russia's second capital after Moscow fell. So now the Russians, they only can move their capital once. So not that the Russians are going to be able to come back anyways, but they're done as far as having a capital and no industrial complex, no income. So the Russians are pretty much done. Like I said, they got 3 units left on the board, or 5 units, and that's it. The U.S. did come out and take a couple of the money islands. Japan will take them right back and at least take out the transports. It might be a couple turns before Japan has the units to come in here. But again, the U.S. sees the writing on the wall. This fleet over here was really doing nothing. So even though these transports will probably die on this Japanese turn coming up, might as well get some money while you can. And the U.S. came up here with a couple of Australian ships and maybe positioned. They're at a naval base, so they can move 3 spaces, maybe come back up to protect western United States, or maybe make a play for the Japanese home islands if they can. And the U.S. also went ahead and dispersed some destroyers as blockers, purchased 10 new destroyers that they placed it outside of San Francisco. Australia kind of just turtled up, pulled back their stack of about 6 or 7 fighters, and built 6 more men. So Sydney's getting built up pretty good. But again, if the Allies are pretty much all just turtling up in home territories to protect things, then they're basically giving up the rest of the map to the Axis, and then it's just simply a matter of time. So we're 8 turns in, and I would assume that by the time we're done with turn 10, it'll be an official Axis victory. But again, the writing's on the wall for the Allies. Turn 9 is in the books, and as I've said for the last couple turns, the writing's on the wall. This is going to be an Axis victory. The earliest you can declare or calculate victory is turn 10. So at the end of turn 10, if the Axis hold 12 or more of the victory cities, they win the game. And right now we're at the end of turn 9, so 1 turn to go, and they currently hold 13. And really the Allies have no chance of taking any of them back. In England, you got a combination U.S. and British forces in the British Home Isles there. So they're stocked pretty well, and the Germans actually don't have any naval units at all left on the board. So London's not in any danger anytime soon. But if you look over the rest of Europe here, I mean, just look at Russia, for instance. There's the swastika flag is flying throughout pretty much every territory in Russia that's worth anything, except for just these last couple over here, which are going to be taken on this turn 10. And the Germans have to leave at least 1 unit in each territory so that the Russian partisans don't spring up in vacated territories. But Russia's been completely knocked out of the game, and there's no chance the Allies can get back into Russia. Europe itself is secure. The Germans went ahead and took Norway back this turn, so they're getting that $5 bonus back. They got a big stack of men and fighters in Western Germany, a bunch of stuff, men, tanks, planes in Paris. And they've even started coming back down into southeastern Europe down here into Romania as a possible target next turn, Turkey. And maybe the Germans will go there. Plus, they're in the Caucasus down here, ready to make a move into the Middle East from that direction. Italy went ahead and took Portugal. So they went up a couple dollars. Portugal was worth $1, and they also took a couple other territories we'll look at in a second. The British were lucky. The 2 ships that were Portuguese were rolled, and both of them, a coastal battleship and a destroyer, both went British. The the United States actually came down and took out this German sub here that was convoying, so that was up $3 for Britain, as well as that was the last German sub in the Atlantic, so now the British will get that bonus as well. So both the British and the U.S. aren't doing too bad as far as their economies go, but just the board itself, as far as territories and whatnot, and just the military and even the overall economic strength is severely tilted in the Axis favor. The Italians came down here, landed in South America, so on this next turn here, they're going to activate all these guys, claim this stack of men, and just be able to sweep all the way through South America. I mean, the Allies have nothing down there to resist, really. A couple of lone British infantry. So if the game was to continue much past turn 10, all of South America would fall, and that would actually open up possibly the southern part of the United States. Over in Africa, the Italians continued to gobble up some empty British territories. They landed over here in Transjordan, took Syria. So Cairo is basically surrounded, and the Italians got quite a bit. They got a big stack of fighters. They got some tacticals. The British do have a stack of 11 fighters, some men, and a couple of tanks, but they really haven't been able to divert any units to Cairo, saving up everything to defend London. So again, maybe Italy will try to take Cairo on this turn 10. Not that they have to, but they might. But even if they don't, or if Cairo holds out, it would just be a matter of another turn or two after that. If the game was to continue, that Cairo would fall. And that would, again, open up all of Africa for Italy. In the Pacific, the Japanese continue to take some of the territories bordering with Russia up here in northern Asia. And again, like the Germans, they're leaving one unit in each territory so that the Russian partisans don't spring up. They've got all of National and Communist China. They've got all of India, except for these couple of territories that the British took back. But the Japanese did take out the last British infantry that was in India. So again, if the game continued much longer, it would just be a matter of going in and taking these vacated British territories. In the Pacific, there was a little bit of a last gasp naval action. Both the Australians and the Americans launched attacks. First, the Australians had a coastal battleship and a cruiser, I believe, that came over into this sea zone, 76, along with a stack of fighters, and they were able to take out a handful of destroyers and 2 Yamato battleships, actually, and they still had like a half a dozen fighters left that flew back to Australia. So that was good. And then the U.S. came from that same sea zone on their turn and came down and attacked a Japanese fleet here. The U.S. lost everything, including a transport and a man and a artillery that were going to land on this island if the naval battle succeeded, which it didn't. The Japanese lost a couple of carriers, a couple of fighters, and then both of these battleships were damaged. But that was really the last gasp for the Allies in the Pacific. As you can see, Australia has no ships at all. The U.S., all their ships are up by Hawaii and the west coast of the United States. Just nothing in the South Pacific left whatsoever. Japan really doesn't have a lot left either. But if you look here in the Japanese home islands, you got 4 Yamato battleships, 2 loaded carriers, about 8, 9 transports with a bunch of men. So again, on this last turn 10, those transports are going to start bringing some men around. They could land in, they actually don't have enough to land in Hawaii yet. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, they can't make it to Honolulu, but maybe Alaska, or maybe start making their way down to possibly invade Australia to take Sydney. But again, the Axis control 13 victory cities right now. The only one, and it's not even a possibility now, but before turn 9 was completed, the only one that might have been taken back was Manila. The U.S. again had a transport here, and a man, or excuse me, their fleet was up here in Sea Zone 95 in the Caroline Islands. So they could have made it over with a man and an artillery. So that would have ended. So turn 9 would have ended with the Axis in control of 12 victory cities. That's still enough for a victory. But then besides that, again, you look up here on turn 10, Japan could have went 1, 2. They're back in Manila, and they would have, 4 fighters and about 16 men against a lone U.S. infantry and artillery. So obviously, there's no way Manila would have held. So that's why the U.S. didn't even bother to go after Manila. They tried instead to take out this Japanese fleet down here. Off the coast of the United States, the U.S. has built up a little bit of a bomber fleet and a bunch of destroyers, but no transports, no men to move around. So the Axis will win this. I'll play out turn 10 here. But again, there's really no victory cities that the Allies can even remotely take back. And even if by some miracle they did take a couple to prolong the game past turn 10, again, the writing is totally on the wall for an inevitable Axis victory. Japan's collecting $99 minus bonuses, Germany $93, even Italy's up to $40. And the three allied countries still in the game, the U.S. is at 71, Britain's at 46, and Anzac's at 11. So just the military and economic balance is so tilted in the Axis favor that even if the game continued past turn 10, it'd still end up being an Axis victory. But we'll see how things look at the end of turn 10. Hello, everyone. Panzer J back with the conclusion of this solo gameplay from Historical Board Gaming's Global War 1939. The game actually officially ended several turns ago, but this is at the end of turn 15 here, so we're going to, and again, this is another endpoint in the game where the Axis have officially secured victory. I was going to keep playing it out a little bit, but once we go over the map here a little bit, you'll be able to tell that the game really has been decided, several turns ago. But we'll officially call it at the end of turn 15, which this is the end of turn 15. If the Axis control 12 of the 20 victory cities, then they've officially won the game. And they actually control 15 of the 20. And there's no chance whatsoever that the Allies can take any of the 15 back. The only 5 victory cities they're still in control of, the Allies, are London, Washington, San Francisco, Sydney, and I forgot what the 5th one was. But yeah, they're only in control of Ottawa. So that was the 5th one. So they're only in control of those 5 victory cities. So the Axis officially actually won the game. I believe it was at the end of turn 10 when they controlled 12 victory cities. And I think they had exactly 12 at that time, which is the condition for victory. So they had officially won the game several turns ago, but I wanted to play it out a little bit longer and see how things, see if there was any possibility of an Allied comeback, which there wasn't. So if we kind of take a look at things, the British here are just holed up in the British Isles, London specifically. I mean, that's a big stack of stuff. They've got 2 stacks of men. You're probably talking roughly around 30, 35 men, probably about 15 fighters, and then a handful of U.S. men and artillery, and that's 3 fortresses in London. So London probably wasn't going to fall for at least several more turns, and it looks formidable, London's defenses, but then when you take into consideration that's about all the British have left, they really have nothing else on the board. They're down to collecting $22, and that was going to continue to go down even further. They were stuck right in the British Isles themselves, and that's it. So it was just going to be a matter of time. I mean, Germany was starting to build up, as you can see here in Western Germany. That's a stack of probably about 20, 25 fighters, about 20 tactical bombers, about a half a dozen heavy bombers, a bunch of men. They were starting to build up a navy. They got some destroyers here, about 10 artillery pieces. Those were going to start to be the beginnings of the invasion force. The Germans themselves, all of Russia, all of Europe, Western Europe, Southeastern Europe. They even went down and took Turkey. They've got a bunch of the territories in the Middle East. They even got a ground unit in Cairo, so they're getting that bonus. So Germany was collecting $108 minus bonuses. So even Sweden was possibly in danger. Germany was building up some units here in Finland to possibly take out Sweden just because they can and add the money there as well. So Germany had more than enough really to take the British. It might have taken a couple of turns. They would have had to build up a transport fleet, but just that air force itself that Germany has, you could bomb London just with that air force and probably wouldn't be able to take out all of London's defenses, but you would have been able to take out quite a bit just with the German Air Force. As far as the Italians, they are also in phenomenal shape. They're up to collecting $57. They own all of South America here. Every single country, even the neutrals, are all Italian. And in Africa, they own, especially in northern Africa, they pretty much own all of that. They've taken all of the British territories over here by Egypt. They've moved into the Middle East a little bit as well. They don't have a ton of units on the board, but they got this fleet over here off of Gibraltar coming over, some loaded carriers and a bunch of men and artillery. And they actually have a pretty sizable force moving up from South America. So if the game would have continued, you could definitely see the Italians moving into Mexico and trying to take the United States from a southern approach. They could have taken the Caribbean islands easily. The Allies themselves only have 4 ships on the board, a couple U.S. destroyers, a British destroyer, and a British battleship. So not much the Allies could have done to prevent any of the islands falling, or even the Axis from convoying all of these boxes here. So Italy was collecting quite a bit. Italy actually was collecting as much as the United States, believe it or not. So as far as the United States on the eastern side, now again, in the United States itself, it looks like they got a bunch. They got 2 stacks of 10 tanks here, another 10 tanks here. They got about 10 heavy bombers, about a half a dozen fighters. So it would have been difficult to take the United States because obviously as the Axis, you've got to buy all the transports to move everything over. This Italian force in South America wasn't going to be enough to take out the U.S. So it would have been turns and turns and turns down the road before the possible conquest of the United States would have happened. But again, the U.S. is only collecting $57. They're getting convoyed a lot. They've lost some of their possessions on the Pacific side of the map, which we'll look at in a minute. So the U.S. still collecting a decent amount of money because they still get the $20 bonus. So they were actually bringing in $77 a turn, but just not even enough really not enough to compete with anybody on the Axis side, especially Germany and Japan. Over here in the Pacific, as you can see, a lot of rising sun roundels spread throughout this side of the map. Total Japanese victory. Japan is up to collecting, I believe, $121, not counting bonuses. So they're collecting a ridiculous amount of money. And they're up to, I believe, $15 in bonuses. So, that's $136 a turn. So that tells you all you need to know as far as the Allied fortunes, especially on this side of the map. All of the Asian continent is in Japanese control. Any Russian territories that are worth anything are all Japanese. All of communist and national China. All of India. All the money islands. Japan's got a nice little navy, a nice little fleet down here with transports and men, carrier and some battleships and cruisers ready to possibly come down and invade Australia. They also, if we kind of look over here, Honolulu fell several turns ago, and you've got some Yamato battleships, loaded carriers, a bunch of transports with a bunch of men. And then up by Alaska, Alaska had fallen several turns ago. You got 3 loaded carriers, some destroyers. The U.S., again, having to put everything in defending San Francisco. So that's probably a stack of about 20, 25 men and about 10 fighters. So again, much like on the European side of the map, as far as the U.S. being able to defend the United States, the continental United States, over here it would have been quite a bit of a stretch for Japan to actually take San Francisco, just because the U.S. can continue to put units in there, and obviously the Japanese got to come over with transports and men and all that. So San Francisco might not have fallen, or at least not for several turns. But again, the U.S. is holed up right on the mainland of the United States. They're getting convoyed in a couple of boxes. They have no navy whatsoever. So Japan would have probably just let the U.S. sit there and dealt with other things first, such as Australia. So Australia is probably going to be the next target. And the Australians don't have nearly the income that the U.S. does. So if Japan would have came over with this fleet and then this fleet up here in Hawaii, that probably would have been enough to take out Australia. The Australians were down just $8 and not much of a factor. So it was 3-on-3 by the time the game ended. Australia, the United States, and Britain against Japan, Germany, and the Italians. Again, both in terms of an official victory, it was the Axis. And again, just looking at the map, just the units on the board alone tilted extremely heavy in the Axis favor. So that's the end of solo game number 1 for Historical Board Games Global War 39. I'll put all these videos together in one long video and get this put up on YouTube for you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it. We'll be back maybe doing a solo 1936 game next time. Take care.